Good afternoon. Welcome to everyone. My name is Victoria Stone-Cadena. I am the Associate Director here at RITM. As part of our mission as a center, we are tasked with supporting research efforts across the university that center around issues of race, indigeneity, and transnational migration. In that effort, RITM supports research and conference attendance for both undergraduate and graduate students throughout the year. We are delighted to welcome you all for this 3-minute research showcase as we hear from Yale graduate students who conducted research with our support this past summer. Each student is asked to synthesize their research in under 3 minutes using just one slide. While challenging, it is always exciting to hear the highlights of important research being done across the campus, which includes researchers tonight or this afternoon from over 11 different departments, as you can see in the program here. After each student presents, we will have time for 1 to 2 questions, and then we'll invite the next speaker. We invite you to join us afterwards for some light refreshments and conversation. I would like to take a moment to give a special thanks to Ryan Huynh, who is a Woodbridge Fellow with us with RITM this year, for all his work in preparation of this event. Likewise, I'd like to thank the rest of the RITM team for their support as well. In keeping this timely, I will now turn this over to Harriet. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Ryan and RITM, for organizing and for giving me the opportunity to offer you a little glimpse of what I've been working on this summer. On the slide, you see an engraving by Abraham Bos of actors performing at the Hotel de Bourgogne in Paris, its most prominent permanent stage in the 1630s. Notice how the actors' bodies are opened up to the audience. The way the performers are arranged shows consideration for stylized physicality and the stage picture. Notice too the costumes, the different styles, the captain with the huge ruff, the lovers in their lavish outfits. Materials that likely had origins way beyond France, testament to France's growing colonial empire. Finally, notice the unembellished and small stage. All this relates to a tradition of traveling companies, when costumes and props were easier to move than sets, and where physicality and visuality were important when voices didn't carry. Significantly, this image depicts not just characters, but real people. The actors you see here were some of the most celebrated French actors of their time, and many of them performed not only in Paris, but also across the country and as far as Belgium and the Netherlands. For example, Charles Lenoir and his wife Isabelle Messifier led the troupe of the Prince of Orange some 10 years earlier, before this image was drawn, bringing their performances to the court in The Hague and to other cities across the Low Countries. The performance cultures of the Netherlands and France were closely connected. In the archives, I found significant similarities in language and content of court orders that gave actors permission to perform, as well as in the size of the playing spaces. Furthermore, these were actors working in Paris as well as across France and the Low Countries, bringing with them style and technique. Thus, by studying French sources, I was able to discover more about what performance in The Hague might have looked like, and thus what the performance of Pierre Corneille's Cid could have been like when it was performed there in 1638. While chiefly presented as a play about impossible love, the Cid is a political adaptation of a medieval Spanish legend. It responds to the centralization of power in France by Richelieu and Louis XIII, the war with Spain, and France's expanding colonial project. My dissertation explores how 4 of the most popular productions of the first decade of Amsterdam's city theatre transformed as they transferred from across Europe, and what implications that has on an understanding of Dutch imperial narratives and identity formation at the time. This semester, I am considering the purpose and consequences of the Cid's circulation. How would audiences in The Hague and subsequently Amsterdam relate to this story of a Spanish national hero at a time when both France and the Netherlands were at war with Spain? How could the different local contexts have informed reception? And finally, how might the character reflect as supranational, white, Christian, European self-fashioning in opposition to the Islamic empires to the east and the south? If you have any thoughts or questions, I would love to hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, everybody.
Hi.
All right. So I study ancient religious texts, especially the Hebrew Bible, within the religious studies department. And what about that I'm most interested is contemporary interpretive approaches that communities develop towards meaning and praxis. So even more fascinating about that is the power dynamics that come into play in the interpretation process, noting the fact that the predominant interpretive approaches and frameworks for a long time have all been white Eurocentric. So some of the key questions for me beyond what is the Bible is how do we read it? And thus, what other non-Western approaches are there? So taking a post-colonial approach, my research explores indigenous knowledge systems, namely African oral culture, literature, history, including proverbs, riddles, story forms, novels, cultural songs, myths, mythologies, etc. To explore new frameworks that there might be to capture African realities, while also contributing to the ongoing discussion on decentering whiteness and multiracializing biblical interpretation in biblical studies. So with support from RITM, I head to Ghana, a West African country with a rich cultural heritage and an important history of colonization, colonialism, independence, and religion. And my research took me to various institutions and sites to observe and to talk to key scholars already doing similar work. So to name a few, some of the pictures you see here, I went to the University of Ghana, I went to the Bible Society of Ghana, Ashasi University, Kofi Christella Institute of Theology and Mission, Methodist University, Trinity Theological Seminary. And aside from spending hours talking to several scholars and graduate students at these institutions, I audited classes, visited libraries, spent some time at various archives. And outside of the university world, I went to the Kwame Nkrumah Museum in the middle picture to explore Ghana and West Africa's history. I also went to the Cape Coast slave castle to explore Africa's history with slavery and colonization, independence, and especially aspects of those that intersect with my interest in indigeneity and newer forms, post-colonial interpretive approaches. Two key moments for me among these were the classes that I audited on translation and enculturation, and my visit to the missions archives at Kofi Christella Institute of Theology. I think that they opened up for me a whole new world of interpretation that is rooted in European-led translation, while also exposing me to the potential of language and language theory, translation theory, for the success of my entire project. Thank you very much.
Okay, hi everyone. My name is Adriana. I'm a PhD student in sociology. And today I will be sharing with you all my project titled Post-Deportation Repeat Migration, Intent to Reimmigrate Among Recently Deported Central American Immigrants. And I presented my working paper with the support of RITM this past summer. So despite their limited access to healthcare and exclusion from mainstream institutions, Latinos in the US display lower mortality and morbidity rates than their native and white counterparts. And this health advantage is often described as the so-called Hispanic health paradox, and it's believed to be a result of the selection of immigrants who migrate to and from the US. For instance, research finds that healthier people are more likely to migrate, and those who are unhealthy are more likely to return home, to seek medical treatment, family support, or to die. However, changes in immigration policy and enforcement has shaped selection into return migration, as immigrants can either voluntarily or involuntarily return home through deportation. But despite the record number of deportations in the past 2 decades, the health status of immigrants who return to the US after being deported remains largely unknown. And this is critical to understand because even though there are significant legal repercussions for attempting to return to the US after deportation, research continues to find that deportees who are deported will be more than likely to return to the US sometime in the future. So my study takes a step towards capturing the complexities of immigrant health by examining the health status of recently deported Central American immigrants who intend to return to the US relative to their peers who will stay in their country of origin. And I draw on data from the Survey of Migration in the southern border of Mexico, also known as ME-SUD, which is a cross-sectional survey that is highly representative of the Salvadoran, Honduran, and Guatemalan adults who are detained and deported back to Central America between 2012 and 2020. And overall, I find that deportees who intend to return to the US are more likely to say that they have poor health relative to their healthier peers who plan on staying in Central America. And I also find that deportees who report negative experiences during their apprehension and detention are more likely to have poor health. So these findings suggest that health selection is a complex process that cannot offer a simple explanation for the health outcome of Latinos. In particular, this could be a result of the Hispanic health paradox being developed at a different historical moment, and it also may fall short in explaining the health outcomes of contemporary immigrants in an era of mass deportation. And as punitive immigration policies continue to change and deportations continue to rise, it's important to explicitly examine the population movement and selection of what I call post-deportation repeat migrants to further understand how they navigate life after their deportation. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I am Diana and I'm a second year in the History PhD program. Gonzalo Gonzalez, the subject of the right-hand article over there, was a working-class Mexican revolutionary and baker who migrated to New York City during the 1920s. Shortly after being laid off from his bakery job in 1929, he became an active member of the Communist Party's Latina chapter in New York. In the summer of 1930, he was assassinated by the NYPD at a march that protested the death of a Black comrade who had also been killed by the police. Around the time that Gonzalo was assassinated, he was one of over 4,000 Mexicans living in New York City. Mexicans represented less than 5% of the city's Latina population, a relatively smaller percentage compared to that of other ethnic groups from Latin America and the Caribbean. However, the life and legacy of Gonzalez demonstrate that Mexicans held visible and meaningful roles in the city's labor and leftist movements of the post-World War I era. While Gonzalez was one of the more remarkable organizers in the city, hundreds of other working-class Mexican migrants were also active members in leftist labor and political organizations. Gonzalez's narrative guides my current research on radical Mexican political culture in post-World War I New York. Over the summer, I became interested in taking a more translocal approach by identifying connections or networks that may have been established between leftist Latina or Mexican chapters in New York City and the Mexican Communist Party, or the MCP. With support from RITM, I spent some time in Mexico City visiting el Centro de Estudios del Movimiento Obrera y Socialista. During my archival visits, I sorted through the periodicals of El Machete, which was the MCP's official newspaper between 1924 to 1938. I came across a handful of articles that confirmed an ongoing dialogue between Mexican leftists in New York and Mexico. In some instances, Mexican New Yorkers invited leaders of the MCP to deliver speeches and conventions. In other occasions, Mexican communists in New York organized mutual aid events aimed at fundraising for El Machete, as shown in the bottom left. Perhaps the most exciting moment of transnational leftist encounters that I came across was when Hernán Laborde, director of El Machete, attended a commemoration event in 1936 honoring the 6-year anniversary of Gonzalez's death, discussed on the right-hand article. The periodicals that I came across generated important questions for my research. For example, to what extent did these ongoing translocal encounters shape radical leftist movements in New York City and Mexico City? What were the contours of this dialectical process? I look forward to addressing these questions in my ongoing social history research on Gonzalez and the lives of working-class Mexicans in post-World War I New York. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Sophia, 4th year in sociology and AFAM. The title of my project is How Youth Creates Race in the 21st Century. Really, it's an attempt to look differently at the increased vulnerability that young Black people and others of color face in the wake of both 2020's racial violence and the neglect of young people in the national response to COVID-19. This comes especially as conflict arises between racial and youth-related public desire. So, for example, the premature return to unsafe school conditions justified by keeping afloat minority and adolescent development, but then condemning the teaching of Black history with claims of being unsuitable for children. In light of these tensions, I explore how Black youth in particular manage these ideological conflicts between constructions of race and youth and the impact of that relationship on policy and sense of self. So this slide today represents 2 of 3 parts to the project. The first is archivally tracing what I see as this relationship historically. How do ideas about race infuse ideas about what it means to be young? So I trace the rise of race science and its view on adolescent development, how fears of peer pressure intersected with fears of school integration, things like that. And then the second part is interviews with young Black people. So I use my RTM funding to compensate them. So I don't have pictures of them, obviously. But I wanted to talk about one shift that I found between these kind of 20th century management tactics that I found in the archives and what I'm noticing now in my interviewees. Because the 21st century Trayvon generation, so to speak, is a coming of age process that's actually characterized by the ubiquity of racial violence online. So young youth of color have always held a voice in their communities and networked with each other over racial issues through media, and how they spoke about these racial issues was tied to ideas about youth. So this poem on the right was written by a 15-year-old after World War II and racial campaigns around that. She was writing in the junior section of the Chicago Defender, a Black newspaper. This picture in the middle was a panel of Black teens who was invited to speak on a TV show about youth delinquency and its racial associations in 1965, right, so around different racial riots. But now, during events of racial violence, the actual form of communication or media is appearing to have an increased impact on the approach to coming of age in comparison to the event itself, right? So the social media accounts that you make as an adolescent rite of passage that cultivate your friendships and so on. So this quote at the bottom comes from an interviewee who was talking about a police brutality incident that happened the same weekend as his prom, and how his Twitter feed was like really in clutter because of the different types of posts that were being shared. And he says, "It's like everyone's on Twitter sharing pictures of prom, and I'm here on Twitter sharing pictures of a dead person. They're like, but this is our youth." Like, okay, but this is mine. So I'm really just interested in knowing how we can pay better attention to ideals about what constitutes youth, how might ideas of race be informing that in ways we might not be noticing that could be causing strife and overwhelm, because I really think knowing more about how these relationships are produced can kind of give us another angle to dismantle them from. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I have notes, but I don't really like reading from notes, so I'm going to try to just do it from memory. Latinx folks here in the United States are the most rapid growing group to convert to Islam, and I'm focusing on Mexico specifically. Pretty much a lot of the major cities in Mexico have mosques and musallas, which are like small prayer rooms. But what I was fascinated by to hear was that in Chiapas, San Cristobal de las Casas, Chiapas, in a rural area, there's an indigenous group, Tzotzil Mayans, that were rapidly converting to Islam, and that really captured my attention. So there are roughly about 400 to 500 Tzotzil indigenous people who converted to Islam in the year 1995. So from 1995 to present, there's roughly about 400 to 500 Muslims. They live in a majority Catholic area. Many of them were either Catholic or evangelical Christians before they converted to Islam. So my question was like, what led this specific community to convert to Islam? Living in a rural part of Mexico where Catholicism is like the mainstream religion, what attracted them to Islam? And also the peculiar thing about this group is like they converted like across a span of like 3 generations and within one family. And so that was interesting to me as well. And so when I visited Chiapas over the summer, I was able to conduct roughly about 30 oral interviews, and I was able to live alongside a lot of the community members there, because there's 5 different Muslim communities there, and so I was able to visit each one. And so how did Islam come to Chiapas? A Spanish Muslim by the name of Nafia came to Spain, from Spain to Mexico in 1994, to Chiapas specifically, and he wanted to convert Comandante Marcos and the Zapatistas. So he's a revolutionary himself. So he's like, I want to combine like this revolution and Islam and join forces. Well, Comandante Marcos wasn't having it. So then he went to other Zapatistas and he was successful in converting them. And so actually Mohammed Amin, who was a Zapatista, he was the first to convert to Islam. So that's another question that I was asking, like connecting Zapatismo and that revolutionary spirit. Was there like a connection to Islam there? I found that there was. I mean, I don't have a lot of time to get into it, but that's one of the questions I want to like further explore. The main reason I gathered why people converted to Islam was that they were really attracted to the fact that it didn't seem so much as like a religion to them. They said they didn't feel like they had to adhere to like rules and strictness. It was more of like a way of life, and it was monotheistic. Here in the photo that I have on the screen, this is a photo of 4 women on Eid, which is a Muslim religious holiday. And as you can see, they're dressed in their traditional tzotzil clothing. And while they're wearing their hijabs/rebosos, I was really interested in like the connection between the hijab and if they found that it was foreign or what, like how did they feel living in Mexico and observing the hijab. And they said that basically like their mothers and their grandmothers wore rebosos, some of them wore rebosos when they were younger. And so wearing the hijab didn't seem something like too far off or foreign to them. And it's kind of cool because I don't think in this picture, but some of them wear their traditional rebosos still as their hijabs. And so, when I interviewed a Muslim leader there by the name of Ibrahim, I asked him if there was a connection to like indigeneity in Islam, and he said that his grandfather actually converted to Islam because he found a lot of similarities with the religion of Islam to his indigenous roots. Just to give you one example, is the prostrations that Muslims perform during their 5 daily prayers. He said that his grandfather was already performing some of those similar prostrations during his prayers following his indigenous faith. And so it resonated with his grandfather, and that's how him and his whole entire family converted to Islam. And what I found most interesting during my research trip was to see how Zapatista revolutionaries were converting to Islam, but also how women found a lot of, I'm quoting, like quote unquote liberation, freedom. And I mean, when I heard them, it's their words, not mine, but when I heard them say that, it was interesting to me because they said the outside world of Mexico sees them as oppressed, but they're like, we actually feel like we're not oppressed at all. And so what I hope to do on my next trip is Omar, who's a former Zapatista, he has a room full of old like newspaper clippings and articles, and they're all like, I mean, they're like filled like up to here, and I didn't have enough time to go through all of them, but I'm curious to just learn more about the Zapatistas and their conversions to Islam, and also just about this indigenous community that like is continuing to, Islam is growing within such a small place like San Cristobal de las Casas. So.
Hi everyone, my name is Christian, 6th year, PhD in history. This summer I spent some time doing consulting some archives, specifically the Standard Food Company archives in New Orleans, in Tulane, and the Whiting Willauer collections in Princeton. That's just the quote that I will translate in a few, but I wanted to speak more broadly about another event. In the summer of 1983, James Carney, later known as Padre Lupe, a U.S. Jesuit priest-turned-guerrilla, left the Nicaraguan border village to Olancho, Honduras, near the Patuca River with a 96-man guerrilla group called the Central American Revolutionary Workers' Party, PRTC, led by former Dr. Jose Maria Reyes Mata, who was once a friend of Che Guevara. A few weeks later, around mid-September, Padre Lupe and most of his comrades were captured and summarily executed by the CIA-trained Honduran Special Forces Command, or the SFC. And so, while the death of most of the Honduran members didn't get much attention, U.S. and Honduran, the death of Padre Lupe a U.S. citizen, certainly caught the attention. Multiple accounts of his death still remain, While the deaths of the Honduran members didn't get attention, the death of Lupe did. And the Honduran authorities were keen on suppressing the details of the death of Padre Lupe because he was a U.S. citizen. Multiple accounts of his death remain plausible, one being he was shot with a .45 caliber pistol along with Reyes Mata, another one saying that he died by malaria, another one decapitated, another one tortured to death, another one thrown out from a helicopter. However, when the bodies of the other insurgents washed out onto the riverbanks of the Patuca River, the authorities remained silent, all while claiming that he died from starvation and illness. The precise fate of Padre Lupe remains unknown to this day. Whether claimed by the unpredictable wrath of nature and disease, or by the covert designs of a CIA-trained operations, his story remains largely untold, shrouded in layers of intrigue and silence. It's a silence that speaks volumes about the very nature of Honduran in the annals of the Cold War narratives. His hidden demise mirrors the paradox of Honduras itself, central to U.S. Cold War agendas, yet often relegated to the footnotes of history. While its terrain and politics were long deemed invaluable for U.S. interest, its true role, much like Padre Lupe's death, went unnoticed, buried under the weight of the larger Central American revolutions. As Padre Lupe's fate remains an unsolved mystery, so does the question, how has a nation so integral, been overlooked in U.S. Cold War history? That's the story of Honduras and how it's lacked a lot of historical production. But within that, a bigger question that I had is how you lose stories like these of Santos Centeno Garcia, who's a Black Garifuna communist and organizer in the 1950s, who was part of the larger labor movements in the 1950s, was also part of an anti-racist organization called the Abraham Lincoln Cultural Society. And so when the product of this lack of historical production has also silenced these histories of working people, working indigenous people, but also working Black people in Honduras. So yeah, that's sort of my intro into that. My dissertation is obviously much more complicated, but yeah, that's sort of what I wanted to leave everyone with. And thank you. I'll take questions.
Hi everyone, I'm Jun Han, a second-year master student with focus on environmental anthropology at School of Environment. My research examined the indigenous environmentalism on the Tibetan Plateau in China. My research interest comes from a contradictory observation when I work with Tibetan conservation NGOs. This is me, this is my main interlocutor. And first, the homogeneous interpretation of Tibetan environmentalism by Chinese conservationists, simply as Tibetan people believed in sacred mountains and lakes. And then the very diverse practices, discourses of Tibetan conservation NGOs. Each NGO's articulations about why and how we should protect nature is very different. This made me curious about one question, how some critical things such as indigeneity, politics, science are articulated in these NGOs' conservation projects, and what we can learn about human-nature coexistence from this complex landscape. So this summer, I went back to Tibetan Plateau and stayed for nearly 3 months in 4 NGOs. 3 of them were led by Buddhist monks, and 1 was led by a Tibetan herder. It was quite an enjoyable journey. I had a chance to visit some old friends and met many new faces in these NGOs and conservation conferences. I did interviews with these NGOs leaders, like these monks, and also did participant observation in raptor monitoring, ecotourism, and other conservation projects. 3 of my primary findings can be summarized as first, the adaptability of indigeneity in Tibetan conservation. It very much relies on environmental leaders, continuous translation between Han Chinese and Tibetan, science and tradition, and others. Second, a vital landscape of Tibetan environmentalism, where diverse practices and discourses coexist through similar cultural structure, but very different social context, social political context, and also personal propositions of these leaders. Third, a general non-Cartesian conservation knowledge of people are nature, co-produced by these NGOs. it might be the next stages of human nature coexistence for us, while the current is more likely people and nature. In short, I hope the result of this research can make voice for indigenous people on the Tibetan Plateau, and also provide alternatives to the global conservation. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Alan, a fourth-year PhD student in the History of Architecture program. My dissertation examines the contested logics of urban development on the Texas-Mexico border in the latter half of the 20th century and focuses on the role of design professionals, namely architects, engineers, and urban planners, and the roles they played in the dynamics of the region's interstate political economy. Amid post-war reconstruction and a global economic development, the design professions established newfound footholds in society by leveraging technical knowledge into innovative forms of managerial expertise. With this expertise in hand, the design of the built environment became an essential aspect of the function of government and access to an interconnected global economy. With the assistance of RITM, I was able to conduct 2 weeks of archival research at the University of Texas Benson Latin American Collection and Alexander Architectural Archives. Specifically, the organizations I was looking at were the American Friends Service Committee collections, the Rodman C. Rockefeller Mexico-U.S. Business Committee files, as well as the collection of the American Planning Association and a planning professor named Hugo Leipziger, who was one of the founders of UT's planning school. The archives, as we can see from the image, presented a kaleidoscopic vision of what the U.S. Mexico was imagined to be between the years of 1960 and 1990. On one end of the spectrum, we see this vision includes the aspiration of modernist architects and local chambers of commerce, projecting a certain image of modernity and prosperity into the borders landscape. And on the other, we find what could be considered like a certain form of urban informality that presupposes an economic structure that requires a certain underclass. As border industrialization attracted inhabitants and capital from both nations and elsewhere, urban populations and their economic impacts ballooned well beyond the scope devised by mid-century planners. As I see it, urban informality itself is the dialectical foil to modernist development on the border. And if anything, we have to consider these two aspects of the built environment in tension with each other. These disjunctures that we're seeing here up on the screen beg the question of, do architects and planners consider themselves willfully ignorant of the effects of their architectural impact, or can we consider this a dereliction of professional duties and civic engagement? But any questions?
Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Roy Soler. I am a second-year PhD, sorry, that's a lie. I'm a third-year PhD student in anthropology. So my research is on Black queer life in the UK. Also, on the weekend, Friday and Saturday, there is something going on, which I'm going to just talk about. So if you could pass that along. But my research is on Black queer life in the UK. But this summer with RITM, I, as well as having money for my research, I also was part of another project, and it's called INBEST, so Intersectional Black European Studies. So this is Berlin Cathedral, and that's obviously me. And so part of this project, and what you're going to see from the little postcard there, is basically Professor Fatima El Taib, who's part of RITM, or Ethnicity, Race and Migration. She is part of a group in Germany of Black women, Black feminists, who are essentially trying to digitize and archive a lot of different different media. So, for example, magazines, posters. So essentially archiving Black feminist literature and different kind of paraphernalia even pertaining to black women, lesbians, black people more broadly. And so what myself and other fellows did, we went down to Berlin and stayed there for 3 weeks, and we were part of the project of trying to digitize a lot of the different magazines that came into our hands. And we went to different places and different spaces to connect with black Germans. So, for example, we went to a place called IOTO, which stands for Each One, Teach One. And so essentially it was a learning experience where we got to learn more about Germany, or Black Germany particularly. And in terms of how this relates to my own research, it was very fascinating to kind of hear the stories and experiences of Black Germans, and how they were similar and different to the Black British context. And so for one example, that one of the Afro-German people that we interacted with, she would mention that in Germany, people would say to her, "Oh, your German is so good. How can you speak such good German?" And she'll say, "Well, I'm from here. I was born here." And the refrain will always be, "But where are you really from?" And so that was something that was definitely something I could connect to, because in the UK, there has been a black population there for a very long time, but often our connection to the nation is denied and repudiated. So so there's a lot of different connections there that I can relate to, but the project more broadly is something that is going to continue. And on Friday and Saturday, as you can see from the poster that's going around, and you can turn it around as well, the stuff at the back to show you who's coming. But on Friday, you're all welcome to come, and we will be having like different discussions and talks, and you're going to have different people, different black scholars and activists from Europe coming to speak about like their work and black European studies. And for example, Gloria Wecker, who's quite well known, she's a black Dutch feminist anthropologist who will be there, and there will be many other people as well, and I will be there as well. But that was kind of a quick little snapshot of what I was doing in the summer in Berlin. So yeah.
Hi, everyone. My name is Zoe Lee Park. I study the normative theory of environmental justice. What should environmental justice look like? The environmental justice movement, if you don't know what it is, it's the poor people of color movement for clean and safe environments for all. Centuries and decades of white supremacy have resulted in many of these communities living in places that are very toxic, very polluted. And in my review of the literature, I found that there's still a real disconnect between scholarly normative arguments and then the grassroots arguments that I was hearing in my own work off campus. And so through my thesis, I sought to bridge this kind of gap. So I pursued a 14-week embedded ethnography with 2 different environmental justice organizations in California. I am from California. These are communities I really love. So during those 14 weeks, I was volunteering and really learning through that volunteering. And so for the first 7 weeks of summer, I was at Green Action for Health and Environmental Justice. They're based in San Francisco. And then for the second 7 weeks of summer, I was at the Central Coast Alliance United for a Sustainable Economy, or CAUSE for short. And CAUSE asked for my support at their Santa Maria office. Santa Maria is a predominantly farm-working community. And so through my volunteering, I learned from my communities what environmental justice and responsibility should include. And I adopted approaches from grounded normative theory. Grounded normative theory is outlined by Professor Brooke Ackerley. And so I sought to use a variety of different empirical methods, developing ideas recursively, being inclusive of different ways of knowing in my communities, and then re-articulating these findings in ways back to my communities that were helpful to them. And so I organized focus groups, which were smaller discussions with my community members, and organized presentation feedback sessions where I asked my communities for feedback on what I was finding. I also attended public meetings, and I conducted several interviews. And I hired 3 research assistants, 3 really brilliant young women from my communities who supported the project tremendously. And so the goal for the thesis is to develop normative theories rooted in the arguments of my community members to really help them shape policy and society towards their visions.
And so now, this semester, back at Yale, I am learning how to analyze my ethnographic field notes. And as I'm analyzing my field notes, I'm combining those findings with my two other methods, which is a content analysis on pieces published by these organizations, and then also a historical analysis on the histories of my communities, how those different histories have shaped the normative arguments they're making. And in the spring of 2024, I'm going to be returning to California to share the findings of this study wherever my community members want me to share. Local council meetings have come up as a big one. And I'm really grateful to the center for all of the ongoing support, especially. It enabled me to hire a third research assistant, really brilliant young person. And so, yeah, thankful for all the support.